The final phase of America's westward expansion was the massive migration of American settlers into the Midwest and Great Plains regions of the United States. These settlers moved west onto land that had been taken from Native Americans through the Indian Wars and the reservation system, and upon arriving, these settlers would encounter a new way of life and become an essential part of the developing American economy in the late 1800s. The process of farming the Great Plains began in 1862 when Congress passed a series of land grant acts helping to open up the West to settlers and make the process of moving west easier. The first of these laws was known as the Homestead Act. This law gave any adult U.S. citizen the opportunity to gain 160 acres of land from the federal government. In exchange for the land, settlers simply had to pay a small registration fee and promised to live on and develop the land for 5 years before selling it or moving on. This made the opportunity of moving west easier for citizens to partake in. The second major action of Congress was known as the Morrill Act. This granted 17 million acres of federal land to the individual states that had been set up in the Great Plains. States were required to sell the land and use the money from the sale of the land to build colleges that would teach agriculture and engineering. This process helped to open up more land to settlers moving west and created some of the largest colleges and universities that exist in the United States today. Schools like Texas A&M and Purdue are schools that developed through the Morrill Act and are important parts of the American engineering and agricultural economy today because of their research into agricultural techniques and engineering. The final action of the federal government became known as the Oklahoma Land Rush, when the federal government offered 11 million acres of former Indian land up to settlers who wanted to move to the state of Oklahoma. More than 50,000 settlers responded and rushed to Oklahoma, hoping to stake their claim to this newly available land. Through these three actions, many settlers who would have been unable to move west because of financial reasons or a lack of available land now had the opportunity and incentive to move west and begin farming the Great Plains. Once the settlers arrived in the Great Plains, they were confronted with a new and difficult way of life. However, their actions would become an important part to the United States economy, giving the Great Plains the nickname the breadbasket of the world. When settlers arrived, they encountered many challenges. While the land in the Midwest is flat and very easy to farm, it was difficult to prepare the land for farming because much of it was covered with grass that had to be removed before farmers could begin farming their fields. In addition to the land challenges, the weather in the Midwest varies greatly from season to season. Winters could reach as low as 30 or 40 degrees below zero and often included blizzards in the northern states of North Dakota and South Dakota. In some of the southern states, summer weather reached as high as 100 to 110 degrees, and the land was very dry. This high temperature, along with the dry land, would make it difficult for farming and often resulted in harsh or severe weather such as tornadoes that settlers had to deal with. In order to farm this new land, farmers had to develop a series of new farming techniques in order to be successful. These techniques often gave farmers a series of nicknames, such as the nickname sodbusters. This nickname was used to describe the farmers who had to use deep steel plows invented by John Deere to break through the tough sod and soil in order to prepare their fields. Once the fields were prepared, farmers had to use a new technique known as dry farming because of the lack of water in many of the Great Plains states. This forced farmers to plant hardier crops such as red wheat and to also leave parts of their fields unplanted so that they could preserve water in that soil and use it to promote the growth of their other crops. Lastly, farmers had to invent and use a variety of mechanical farming equipment such as the McCormick Reaper or threshing machines for cutting down large stalks of wheat. Once these machines were available, it allowed farmers to create larger farms and increase their crop production. In addition to the challenges of farming life, Many of the settlers had to build their own homes without the resources necessary to build them. Since there were few trees, there was very little wood for framing and constructing houses, so settlers used bricks of sod or other hunks of dirt to create their houses, as you can see in the picture down in the right-hand corner. These bricks of sod often dried out and had to be replaced, and because of the difficulty of building homes, many of them were small and uncomfortable and only included one room. As a result of the difficult lifestyle of farmers and settlers in the Midwest, every member of the family had to take on their responsibilities. Everyone, including children, had daily chores. Women often made and mended clothes, washed the clothes, made soap and other household items, and prepared the meals for their families, while husbands and sons took responsibility for the developing, farming, plowing, and harvesting of crops throughout their fields. Many families raised chicken or other livestock to provide sources of meat and protein for the difficult lifestyle. And due to the lack of community, all children were homeschooled and taught the farming methods that they would need to know to eventually move on and have their own families and their own farms. As more settlers began to arrive in the Midwest, communities and small towns began to develop. In most of these towns, they established organizations to help people deal with the difficult lifestyle they were encountering. This included local churches and schools in many of the towns, as well as the creation of an organization known as the Grange, which began in 1867. The Grange was developed to promote the social and economic interests of farmers and people living in the Midwest. They formed cooperatives that helped farmers bring their crops to market and sell them, as well as getting bank credit for loans to buy crops, tools, and other items that they would need to farm. On the political front, the Grange helped to promote what were known as Granger laws in Congress and in the states of the Midwest. These laws helped to make farming easier and more financially feasible for the farmers who were moving into these regions. In addition to the farmers of the Great Plains, cattle ranchers who raised longhorn steers, seen in the picture in the upper right-hand corner, became an important part of the growing economy in the Midwest and Great Plains. These cattle ranchers developed as a response to the increased demand for beef that was coming from the eastern states of the United States and their growing populations. As more and more cattle were raised, cattle towns developed near railroad lines so that cattle ranchers could take their cattle to trains and get them shipped back east to where the demand was occurring. As a result, a new type of employment and a new job known as a cowboy developed. Cowboys were ranch hands who helped track the huge roaming herds of Texas Longhorn on the cattle ranches and who then moved them from the ranches to the railroad lines through what are known as cattle drives. As you can see from the picture of the cowboy, their style of dress was very unique. Many of their clothing items served a purpose related to their job. Due to the amount of time they spent in the sun, cowboys were forced to wear hats to protect themselves from the sun, as well as from weather such as hail and rain, and at night on cattle drives, their hats could be used as a pillow. Their vests kept their arms free to allow them to perspire and to have their perspiration evaporate under the hot sun of the Great Plains states. Their bandana protected their face from sun and dust. Their chaps protected their legs from brush and other plants as they marched the cattle through the field. Their gloves helped to keep their hands protected from rope burns. And their lariat, the rope of a cattle rancher or a cowboy, was used for lassoing cattle and directing them in the direction they wanted them to go on a cattle drive. American cowboys learned their techniques from Mexican ranchers known as vaqueros. These vaqueros would train the cowboys in the skills that they needed to successfully raise and transport cattle. The life of a cowboy was very difficult and challenging. Cowboys often spent weeks or months alone out on the wide open range of the Midwest states as they conducted cattle drives, and they received fairly low wages for the dangers and the responsibilities that they would incur. The job of a cowboy included three major responsibilities, including the roundup, or the gathering and branding of young cattle so that they could be kept track of and to show ownership of the cattle. They also had to break horses and train them for their role in the cattle drive. And then lastly, they had to conduct the cattle drive, which was a large march over hundreds or thousands of miles from a ranch to a railroad station where they could then sell and ship their cattle east. Cattle drives were often dangerous, and cowboys could be killed through stampedes or encountering bad weather. They also had to deal with other dangers such as disease and cattle thieves who would come and steal cattle, as well as a variety of animals that could endanger them or the lives of the cattle. Despite these challenges, many cowboys were often known for their manners and the polite way in which they met and encountered other people. Cowboys were taught to never ask a person their name because the person may be hiding something or may not want to be known in the area. Cowboys were taught to always treat a woman with respect, to be hospitable to strangers because you may need their help someday, and to be truthful and hardworking. Many cowboys kept to themselves, focused on their work, and did not go out of their way to engage with other people unless they encountered them on a cattle drive. Due to the fact that most of the territory in the Great Plains and western part of the United States had just been brought into the Union and become states in the 1860s and 70s, there was a significant lack of local government and law enforcement throughout the territory. This led two groups of people to dominate life throughout much of these territories. These groups were outlaws and the lawmen who would try to track them down. Outlaws were habitual criminals who were known for their lifestyle of frequently drinking, gambling, fighting, and patronizing brothels that began to develop. Three of the most notorious outlaws were Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Charles Boyles, also known as Black Bart. Jesse James was a Confederate soldier and the leader of the James Gang, which frequently engaged in bank robberies and stagecoach robberies throughout the territories. James famously declared that he would never be taken alive and was eventually shot in the back and killed after a $10,000 bounty was put out on him for his crimes. Billy the Kid was a legendary and ruthless killer who made his living as a gambler, cattle rustler, and gunfighter. Kid was arrested and convicted for murdering a sheriff, but eventually escaped and was killed in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, at the age of 21. Black Bart was a stagecoach robber who stole over $18,000 during 28 stops of Wells Fargo stagecoaches. Unlike Kid and James, Bart was known for his courteous and polite treatment of passengers. He would frequently allow them to keep their personal possessions and only take the possessions and the money that was from the Wells Fargo company. Bart was eventually arrested and sentenced to 6 years in the San Quentin prison in 1884. These men and their actions are yet another example of the dangers that awaited the settlers moving west during westward expansion. In order to address the actions of outlaws, lawmen began to spring up throughout much of the western territories. Three of the most famous lawmen are Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, and Bat Masterson. Wild Bill Hickok had been chief scout for General George Custer during the Indian Wars, and after his term in the Army, he became a sheriff. Wild Bill was ultimately murdered while playing poker in a saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota, a fate that often encountered many lawmen who challenged the outlaws of the territories. The most famous lawman was probably Wyatt Earp. Earp was a frontiersman, buffalo hunter, and saloon keeper who moved west like many other settlers. However, once he arrived in Tombstone, Arizona, hoping to mine for silver with his brothers, he was forced to become a sheriff and eventually a U.S. Marshal when he and his brothers began feuding with the outlaw gang the Cowboys. Their feud led to a series of gunfights and confrontations in Tombstone, most famously the gunfight at the OK Corral that is portrayed in the movie Tombstone in the video clip.
Your call. Give Doc the shotgun. They'll be less apt to get nervy if he's not a street officer. Goddamn kid. How the hell did we get ourselves into this?
You don't have to worry about a thing. I just went over there and disarmed.
You did? Well, I'll go with you.
Gentlemen, I'm not going to allow any trouble.
Here to disarm you, throw up your hands. Oh, not what I want. Cut.
Oh my God.
Don't shoot. I got no gun. Please, don't shoot me. I got no gun.
Fight commence. Get the fight or get away. Hey, shut the door.
Give me a gun.
Damn it. Behind us.
I got you now, you son of a bitch. Lord Daisy, if you do.
Quiet now.
Confrontations, as you can see from the video, confrontations between lawmen and outlaws frequently occurred in public, in areas of towns and cities, which endangered the lives of other citizens. For their actions at the OK Corral, Wyatt Earp, along with his brothers Morgan and Virgil Earp, and their friend Doc Holliday, were put on trial for the murder of members of the Cowboys gang that were killed. Ultimately, the four men were found innocent, and they continued their careers as sheriffs and eventually Earp becoming a U.S. Marshal. The third and final lawman who became widely known during this time period was Bat Masterson. Bat Masterson fought against the Comanche and Cheyenne during the Indian Wars and eventually became sheriff of Dodge City, Kansas. Masterson was a friend of Wyatt Earp and worked with him in Tombstone before moving on to Dodge City. The events of westward expansion dramatically changed the western part of the United States. Much of the land in the Great Plains was considered open range prior to westward expansion. It was public land where ranchers could graze their huge herds of cattle and that settlers could settle down and farm upon. However, as the West developed, people began to buy what are known as range rights in order to control access to water and some of the other resources needed in order to successfully farm and ranch. This cut out competition from many other farmers and ranchers and led to individual ranchers developing larger and larger farms and ranches. The cattle drive became an essential part of life in the western part of the United States and the Great Plains. Cowboys were frequently seen herding their cattle to market from Texas up to the northern cities in Nebraska and Kansas, where the railroad lines were located. Cattle drives led to the creation of significant cattle trails, such as the Chisholm Trail, which is the most widely known and widely used trail, as well as the Goodnight Loving Trail and the Western Trail that are depicted in the picture in the upper right-hand corner. At the end of these cattle trails, towns such as Dodge City and Abilene developed, where there were boarding houses, hotels, saloons, restaurants, and cattle depots for getting cattle onto trains. Collectively, the settling, farming, and ranching of the land in the Great Plains brought about an end of the open range. Through technological advancements such as the refrigerated rail car and improvements in railroad technology, crops and cattle could more easily and more efficiently be transported back east from the farms of the Midwest. This led to increased competition between farmers and cattle owners, as well as new types of farmers such as sheep owners. As more and more people began to settle, they staked claim to their land and began to protect it with the invention of barbed wire, which helped to keep cattle and other animals contained and prevent them from running away. As more and more people began to find success, a phenomenon known as range wars developed, where large and small ranchers would continually compete and fight over access to the resources and land that was available. As the range wars progressed, more and more small farmers were put out of business, and large farmers began to take over more and more land, leading to larger ranches, larger farms, and increased agricultural production throughout the West. These changes set the stage for the Industrial Revolution of the early 1900s, as we were now able to produce massive amounts of food that could be shipped throughout the country easily to feed the growing populations of American cities.